Here are 10 rules you can adopt which will help you profit from being less logical than everybody else. Number 1, the opposite of a good idea can be another good idea. Conventional logic loves the idea of the single right answer. Business and policy making loves the idea of the single right answer, because once you've come up with a single right answer, however narrow the material you've used to derive it, no one can really blame you, because you can say, no subjectivity was involved in my decision, I have gone with what the model told me to do. That's wonderful if you want to keep your job. If you want to have an original idea, it's potentially disastrous. Rule number 2, don't design for average. Most models cause you to aggregate people so that you're solving the problem for a single representative individual. That makes problems very, very difficult to solve, because improving things for the average person, or indeed developing new products for the average person, it's pretty difficult to find anything they'll like. Look out on the extremes, however, and you may find things that will be adopted by extreme or unusual consumers, which then make their way into the mainstream. But starting with the assumption that there's a single representative person with lots and lots of average characteristics for whom the solution has to work, you've just basically created a dead end for yourself. Rule number 3, it doesn't pay to be logical if everybody else is being logical. There's a simple reason why you can't be logical in military strategy. It means you're predictable. The enemy will know what you're going to do. In the same way, in business strategy, it doesn't pay to be logical, because logic will probably get you to the same place as everybody else. Now, being in the same market space as everybody else is essentially a race to the bottom. What you've got to do is find out what your competitors are logically wrong about, because their use of logic is too narrow and restrictive, and find out what's wrong with their model and exploit it. If you want to buy a house in London, nearly everybody goes, I want to be near a tube line. The problem is that the tube map's open to everybody and everybody uses it. Don't get yourself a tube map, get yourself a rail map and say, I want to be close to a railway station. Nobody's thinking that. And you can buy a much cheaper house which will get you to work in half the time than your tedious tube journey from Fulham will. Alchemy rule number 4, the nature of our attention affects the nature of our experience. Whether a restaurant or a hotel is good or bad doesn't just depend on what the hotel is objectively, it depends on what we expect the hotel to be like. One of the 5 best hotels I've ever stayed in my life was in East Berlin, or the former East Berlin, and it had previously been, I think, a police station or a prison. It had Spartan rooms with, I think, just one wall hanging. Your bed was on a platform above the shower. It had one black and white television tuned to one channel, which showed The Big Lebowski on continuous loop. Okay? Now, here's the thing. If you had turned up at that hotel expecting the Marriott, it would have been the worst experience of your life. If you'd turned up expecting a really cool East Berlin experience, it would be possibly the best hotel of your life. Alchemy lesson 5. A flower is simply a weed with an advertising budget. Nature engages in quite a lot of what seems like pointless and inefficient display. But the very pointlessness and extravagance of this sometimes is what conveys meaning to us. Broadly speaking, when you invite people to your wedding, you don't make your wedding vows door to door, and you don't send the invitation out by email. You send out an expensive or costly, creative or just elaborate invitation, and you make your vows in front of everybody you know simultaneously. In attempting to make advertising an efficiency game, we've completely lost sight of a large part of what advertising works, which is that it's costly to deliver, costly to generate, and is, in many cases, displayed indiscriminately. It's those things that give it effectiveness. Trying to make something efficient and trying to make something effective are not the same thing. Flowers discovered this 20 million years ago. 6, the problem with logic is it kills off magic. Once you devise what seems like a logical schema or map for things, then essentially what you'll be doing is creating something which is modelled on physics and simple GCSE or children's mathematics. something which is solvable, something which always gives you a single right answer. The problem with that is that the rules of logic demand that there can be no magic. The rules of logic would effectively say, if you want to improve people's experience of a hotel, you don't change their perception of a hotel, you have to improve the hotel itself. That's a completely wrong-headed assumption. Context is a marketing superweapon, and it works because it works magically. If you simply think that people perceive the world objectively, you will be confined to improving people's experience and improving the value of your product exclusively by doing objective things. Now, the very fact that Apple, which is the first highly subjective technology company, is worth in the region of $1 trillion, should, I think, give the lie to this approach. Rule number 7, a good guess which stands up to empirical observation is still science. So is a lucky accident. There's actually a philosopher who describes himself as a methodological alchemist, who's a man called Paul Feyerabend. He effectively says that when you look at scientific discovery, the idea that all worthwhile discoveries have been arrived at by obeying very strict rules of scientific methodology simply doesn't hold true. He supports an anything-goes approach to trying to find solutions. After all, why would you let methodological purity actually restrict the size of your solution set? It makes no sense. Not if you want to make science useful rather than as a status signaling vehicle for obsessive rationalists. And so in the same way, one of the things we've got to learn to do, quite simply, is we've got to be much more comfortable with progress that arises from random accident, not only allowing people who are wonderful at explanation or post-rationalization to monopolize the toolbox of progress. Most of evolutionary progress, after all, happened kind of by total fluke. Rule number 8, test counterintuitive things because nobody else will. One of the things you've got to realize in business is that it's unbelievably risky and dangerous being slightly bonkers in business. The slightest bonkers thing you do which fails, your job's on the line. Do something rational that fails, you get to try again. What that bias means is that you can enjoy an extraordinary competitive advantage in your business if you create a small space where people can test things that don't make sense. Now, a large part of a business has to exploit the things the business already knows. I accept that. But just as bees allow a certain number of bees to make random journeys which disregard the waggle dance, in the same way, humans in an organization have to be given a certain amount of permission to experiment with things outside the rationalist's comfort zone. And the great value of experimenting in that area is that most of your competitors are too scared to go there. So when you do enjoy a competitive advantage for that reason, it tends to be a remarkably sustainable one. Rule number 9, solving problems using only rationality is like playing golf using only one club. I'm not disputing the fact that rationality has its uses, but every time you construct a rational, neat, sort of naive model of the world, arguably what it leaves out may be more important than what you put in. After all, your prioritization will be you're assuming what's important to people. You're also making a whole bunch of assumptions, in a sense, about how people think, decide, and act, which may be based on a very, very narrow view of human motivation. And so the second you essentially say, the way to solve this problem is by doing this, what you've done is, without realizing it, you've defined the problem in a way that actually allows for a very small solution set. If you define the problem in economic terms, the solution boils down to basically fining people or bribing people. Now, those are perfectly worthwhile solutions to behavior change. Incentives do work. But, as I said, that's one golf club among many. There are lots and lots of reasons why people do the things they do, and economic incentives only cover a small part of them. Number 10, dare to be trivial. I'm a huge fan of trivia, because quite often the trivial, stupid thing, adding a single sentence to a call center script, for example, has a bigger effect at widening the bottleneck than much, much bigger things do. Why do I say dare to be trivial? Well, in the need to be rational, people construct models which are, roughly speaking, modelled on a very simple idea of physics, child's idea of physics. And what a child's idea of physics or a child's idea of economics has within it is the idea of proportionality, that the scale of the effect on human behaviour is proportionate to the scale and cost of the intervention. That simply is not true in a complex system. In a complex system, really, really small things, butterfly effects in other words, can have enormous effects. If you believe that your system is conventionally kind of rational and mechanistic, you will assume that big changes in behaviour require big interventions. This is miles away from the truth. Let me give you a very simple example of something I noticed the other day. I'm quite keen to buy an electric car. Before I buy an electric car, I want to be damn sure I can install a 7 kilowatt charging point at home. I can get a generous grant of £500 to install the charging point, but before I can get this grant, I have to prove I already own an electric car. Now, I don't want to be rude, but I'm not happy to order an electric car until I know that the charging point works. Something as simple as reversing the order of a decision, in this case, could have an order of magnitude effect, but if you look at life through a narrow economic lens, those tiny little decisive interventions never prevent themselves. And my 11th rule of 10, because why confine yourself to just 10? After all, we're looking for solutions here. We're not trying to look clever. We're not trying to look right. We're simply trying to solve problems. And when you want to solve problems, be open-minded. Don't restrict yourself to 10. And here my suggestion is really, really simple. If there were already a logical answer, we would have already found it. Now, this isn't the Middle Ages. There isn't a shortage of people who are desperately trying to look logical to each other. You can call them McKinsey, you can call them your board of directors, you can call them your finance department, you can call them your procurement department. Rational people are all over the sodding place and they control everything. Therefore, if a problem is persistent, it's fairly likely, I would suggest, that the reason for the persistence of that problem is that it's logic proof. There may be a solution to it, but conventional linear rationality isn't going to find it. And so, a little while ago, I totally hate things that aren't dishwasher proof. So I said to my wife, look, here's a suggestion. For 2 years, we'll treat everything in the kitchen as if it's dishwasher proof, and by a process of Darwinian elimination, 2 years down the line, everything that survives by definition will be. Now, in the same way, if you expose everything to logic and the thing still persists as a problem, it's fairly reasonable to assume that logic isn't the answer to that particular problem. So the problems that persist, the problems that bedevil government decision-making, the problems that divide politicians, the problems that obsess businesses, are probably still problems because no one's yet had the balls to try an irrational solution to them. So if I had a 12th rule, it would be even simpler still. Dare to look stupid. And one of the simplest ways to solve a problem is to ask a question that no one's asked before. Now, why might a question never have been asked before? One of which is that no one was clever enough to ask it. A more likely explanation is that no one was stupid enough to ask it. Because there are a large number of questions asking which makes you sound really dumb, because there's a pre-existing rational explanation for that particular question. So let's take an example question I asked, which I wouldn't be surprised had never been asked by anybody in the previous 10 years, because anybody in the rail industry, for example, or anybody in transport policy would have felt like a bit of a dick asking it. And it's this: why do people dislike standing up on trains? Now, okay, I'm not talking about 3-hour train journeys here. I ought to be absolutely clear. I'm talking about commuter rail. I'm talking about journeys of 25 minutes, half an hour, 40 minutes. Most of the time, after all, that's as long as you have to stand because people get off the train and you get a chance to blag their seat. Now, why do people dislike it? Actually, maybe to some degree they don't. It's quite common on the tube to see people who are standing continue to stand long after many seats become available. But let's also ask the question, is it, for example, simply that it's tiring to stand up and it's relaxing to sit down? May be true. On the other hand, you've been at a desk all day, standing up for a bit may not be that bad. Now, it may be that it's a question of balance, that once I've got to hold on to something, I can't use my mobile phone, I can't read a book, I can't read a newspaper. I'm basically bored because I'm standing staring into space like an idiot. It could be that I feel cheated because I've paid my rail company for a seat and I haven't got one. It could be actually simply because, if you think about it, the people with seats get everything and the people who stand get nothing. If you get a seat, you get a seat, you get a table, you get a place to put your coffee cup, you get a place to put your laptop, and you get a nice view looking out of the window. If you're standing in the middle of a train, you get precisely 4/5 of bugger all. You don't get any of those things. Moreover, if you've got nothing to hold on to, 90% of your mental effort is now concentrated on the subtle art of not falling over and looking like a twat. So, if all your effort's expended on this and there's no upside to standing, people can't tell themselves a story about why it might be good to stand on a train. Let's try redesigning trains for a bit. Let's make half the carriages in a train, put the seats inboard. They're in the middle. You get no view and you don't get a table. Maybe you just get a cup holder. Along the windows are nice little bum rests, so you can actually balance yourself, small little desks for a mobile phone or a tablet, and a couple of USB chargers combined with a nice view out of the window. Now, interestingly, remember Aesop's The Fox and the Grapes for evidence of this. You can tell yourself a story about why standing is actually a choice and not a compromise. And the way people feel about it may be completely different. There's a very handy trick in human psychology which is called adaptive preference formation, which is if we're sometimes forced to do B over A or A over B, we construct a narrative in which we prefer A anyway because it minimizes feelings of regret. If you can design choices so they actually build in the potential for adaptive preference formation, you can actually make nearly everybody happy with an outcome. If you design choices so that B is inarguably better than A and there's no possibility of a countervailing narrative, half the people are pretty happy, half the people are pretty angry. You can create net utility out of nowhere by simply constructing a narrative by which people are essentially happy with, in other words, the compromises they have to make, they can reframe as choices. And so the really interesting thing is, if you can construct a kind of, I suppose the way you could describe it, is a multivariate choice, so that there are upsides and downsides to two possible decisions, the level of human regret and misery is actually minimized. Now, this is a form of alchemy. You're constructing value out of absolutely nothing. Now, you can either despise that because it depends on cheap psychological tricks, or you can go, actually, that's rather wonderful and magical, why don't we use it a bit more?